The Hearthstone Starcraft crossover has finally happened, and these are the top 5 decks from the Starcraft miniset. In this video, I'm going to go over my choices for what are the tier 1 decks in Hearthstone. So I've got 10 meta-relevant, top-of-the-tier, cream-of-the-crop decks that you definitely want to play if you want to hit Legend, but I've also got 17 other decks in case you are interested in exploring some of the other cards. In case you want to play some of the newer cards and try to have the most success with them, because I'm going to be honest, some of these decks are just not going to be that good, and there's nothing else that can be done about it right now because there are just some archetypes and some decks that really just didn't feel like they got enough support, but there are some decks that are absolutely eating right now. So let's go ahead and talk about the best decks in Hearthstone. And sadly, I have to start the video with some bad news. Unfortunately, the best deck in the meta right now is Dumbgar Druid. Now don't worry, I only have this and one other deck that has absolutely no new mini set cards, because the rest of this video is 25 decks that actually have mini set cards that have meta relevancy. But it is just really sad to say that this is undeniably the best deck in the meta right now. Whether or not this is the perfect 30, I really don't care. I'm not going to give you guys the perfect 30 on a Dumbgar Druid deck, but I'm just going to say that Blizzard, something needs to change if this is the best deck in the meta, because one thing that really scares me about Dumbgar is that going into rotation, it really is only losing cards like Crystal Cluster as well as like Lifebinder's Gift. You are still going to have Arcanite Revelation for some card draw. You're still going to have New Heights for ramp. I don't know if gifts are rotating out, but if gifts are staying, then that means that they're also keeping all of the early game ramp. And then suddenly you still have Trail Mix into Dumbgar. Dumbgar can still pull Zilliax. It can still pull Stargazer as well as Spitting Rock. The other cards that are rotating are going to be Thunderbringer and Eonar as well as Yogg. So like, it is losing some pretty big gas. But this deck is really annoying, and the fact that Zilliax gets pulled and then you still have Hydration Station, Infinite Loops, there's just going to be something else that's going to replace some of these other cards. So yeah, Dumbgar Druid is a deck that definitely needs to be dealt with eventually. And the last boring deck we're going to be talking about in this video is Weapon Rogue. It's the best deck in the game because it's beating everything that can't kill it by turn 5, and it's ignoring all of the board-based stuff because it just has Deafen to get rid of taunts. I really hate that I have to keep bringing up this deck, but it's still really good, and it has one of the best win rates in top Legend. If you're a budget player and you really want to sell your soul for some ranked wins, this is the deck to play. And now finally we can start talking about some of these newer cards and newer decks. And I've already talked about Tempo Starship Shaman, but there's a scene and a setting that I want to sell you guys on right now. And that is the idea that Starship Shaman is not just the tempo deck. This deck is effectively Swarm Shaman with some other, good tempo tools like a Missile Pod Starport, so that way you always have minions on the field in order to threaten, as well as getting, synergies of launching your Starship at a cheaper cost. This is just a really good deck right now because it always is on the board, it's always doing something, and it still has, the added benefit of still being Swarm Shaman with just a little bit of extra flavor. In fact, the best way that I can describe it is that it is Swarm Shaman with consistent AoE, so that way you don't have to fight so hard with your minions to maintain the board. All you have to do is launch the minions, get the AoEs, stick a board, and you're absolutely cooking. So it's just one of those things to where I would highly recommend to play this deck right now if you just want to play some good old tempo gaming. But the reason why I wanted to show you that deck first is because at top Legend, it seems to be that the best deck in the game, outside of like a Dumbgar Druid or, Weapon Rogue scamming you, is going to be scamming with infinite combo loops. Now, this is not the perfect 30. This is actually the Patient Zero that got all of this this infinite Shaman nonsense started. But I will be covering this deck in a future video, really talking about how good Fizzle Infinite Shaman actually is. And I'm really surprised that we didn't see anything like this beforehand. But here's essentially how the deck works. You want to play Fizzle on some particular cards like Insidious, Shutter Block, and your Jim Raynor, for example, because you want to be able to generate an infinite loop where your snapshot is consistently giving you a win condition or armor gain. So the whole point of this deck is to play Fizzle, have those cards in the snapshot. You want to also have a Triangulate in the snapshot, so that way when you play Triangulate, you are going to be able to shuffle even more snapshots in the deck that have that Jim Raynor, that Shutter Block, that Insidious, that Triangulate. So that way when you play the snapshot again, you can play your Insidious, play the Triangulate, again, that came from the snapshot in order to keep generating infinite snapshots. You never take fatigue, you always generate damage, or you always generate armor, depending on how exactly you are aiming to win the game. Whether you need to kill an infinite warrior because you are shuffling infinite damage into your deck, whether or not you need to just outlast anything that exists, because this deck does play Arcanite Defense Crystal, and the way that Jim Raynor works is that he relaunches every single Starship that you've launched this game. So one thing that you can do is you can potentially launch 2 starships depending on what the pieces are that you get from the starboard, such as gaining armor, for example. Don't forget, this has a 7 armor gain if you do happen to launch it. So you can easily play Shutter Block, 1 mana Shutter Block into Jim Raynor in order to bring back 6 starships that effectively only gain you armor. This deck has a lot going for it, and this isn't even the perfect 30 in my opinion. So I have 2 other Infinite Starship Shaman decks that I wish to show you guys in order to showcase what exactly is going on with the evolution of this deck. Because I'm going to be honest, I'm really not even sure if the perfect 30 of this deck is ever going to exist, because you change the deck around depending on what exactly you are seeing and what you are experiencing on ladder. So case in point, there's a lot of weapon rogues. You can just infinitely shuffle a bunch of glacial shards, so that way you don't have to worry about that. Or you have like Odin warriors you have to go up against every now and again. You can lock them out by infinitely shuffling a glacial shard. You also have cards like Hex, which are really good at stopping decks like Zerg DK. Anything that has like an impactful death rattle, you can just get rid of it. Or in a bigger brain instance, the worst card to get from Starport is actually the Medevac, because when you launch the ship and it summons minions, that limits your Shutter Block Raynor synergies, right? Well, what if you just hexed it away because you don't really want this card off of the starboard? It's actually Omega Genius if you happen to do it in that way. Turns out hexing your own minion can be correct in some instances. But then you also have cards like Grifta in order to steal minions. You can infinitely shuffle this in order to make sure your opponent has nothing that they can stick onto the board. This deck is just absolutely bullying people right now. And this might be my favorite archetype in the moment, because something else that you could always do is, what if you wanted to fit in a Dirty Rat in order to stop the other Shaman from being able to play their Shutter Block or their Fizzle and stuff like that? If this deck ends up becoming meta, you need to throw in a Dirty Rat in order to stop that from happening. So this is just really, really weird more than anything, but it's the weirdness that I enjoy, because it's all about your decisions. It's all about opening your possibilities and actually hitting them when the time is right. So I don't know. I tend to like decks like this, but I can totally understand if this becomes the best deck in the game. Infinite combos tend to make people feel really annoyed in the game. And keep in mind, I still have one more Shaman deck to show you. And this is Homi's version of the deck, to where we're playing Busy Peon. So that way our next location can cost 2 less. So that way you could potentially play like, you could play Liftoff on turn 3, hit the Starport, and then you can play the Starport immediately, or you can discount your Fairytale Forest depending on what exactly is going on. I really don't think that Busy Peon should be in this deck, but Homi was able to secure, I think, a top 50 or top 100 ranking with this deck, going with like a 60, almost 70%. The possibility of this deck is absolutely crazy, and I just wanted to show you guys these infinite decks, because guess what? I still have one more infinite deck to show you. Infinite meta is actually a thing right now. So I have some good news and I have some bad news about Warrior. The good news is Warrior does have a good deck. The bad news is this is the only good Warrior deck, I believe, in the entire class, because Odin really doesn't matter too much right now. Like, you could play him and have some success with him, but there's just too many fast decks that are going to be able to just destroy your armor count before it even matters. It's just, Odin Warrior really just doesn't feel like it has a lot of gas waiting for it right now, which is why everyone really seems to be jumping on the Boom Boss strat, because who cares about putting your opponent at 0 if you could just destroy every single one of their cards in the deck, and then Fatigue just finishes them off. And then you also still have to worry about Infinite Fizzle, unless you are doing something like Infinite Fizzle, gaining a bunch of armor after you played Odin. There's really no point in playing Odin. It would just be better to infinitely shuffle bombs into your opponent's deck, so that way you can maybe deal with like eruptions or snapshots. I really don't know how exactly the Infinite Shaman versus Infinite Warrior matchups tend to go, but I'm not gonna find out, because I think if I just go up against a Warrior, I'm gonna like just make them coin flip and be like, you just want a 50-50 on this? I don't want to waste 45 minutes to an hour trying to figure out if we're gonna hit the turn limit, because that's exactly what's gonna happen. And it's really sad to note that this is essentially just the same deck we've been seeing, but it does run Jim Raynor. It does at least have a way of like trying to play a new card, but essentially all this is really doing is being in the snapshot, so that way you can keep bringing back the Starship that keeps gaining you armor. It's effectively another copy of Hydration Station. It's not really doing anything different, but it is kind of equipped in the meta in order to handle some of these other strategies that you will see. And one thing that needs to be said, Liftoff is just a really good card. This is just an insanely good card because these kind of decks didn't have consistent card draw, and this consistent card draw pretty much makes the archetype even somewhat playable. So the fact that you can even draw your Draenor consistently, the fact that you can draw your Starport or your Starship pieces, it's the best thing about this deck, because you need the consistent card draw in order for the gas to get going. You just need stuff to do in your earlier turns that isn't necessarily just always playing the Tortollan Traveler on 3 or New Heights on 3. It's nice, but now you have some other options. So Infinite Warrior really does feel like it has a lot going for it, but it is really sad to me that it seems to be Infinite decks, Scam decks, and Turbo Aggro that seems to be the only way to really have success on ladder right now. And what is this? I think I lied to you guys, because this is yet another possibility for an infinite deck that's actually really good in the game right now. But the difference between this deck and the other infinite decks is that this is more so your second win condition. Your primary win condition is actually to win with cards like Hydralisk by discovering a whole bunch of cards like Incendious, for example. You have the possibility of getting your Giants out on the field, so you have honest to God tempo that you can use to put your opponent at 0 health. So that's why I think that this Hunter deck is actually really interesting. I haven't tried this yet, but I will be trying it soon, because one of the best high rolls that you can potentially do with this deck is playing Spawning Pools and then playing Parrot Sanctuary to potentially get your South Sea Giants as early as turn 3. That's right, as early as turn 3. Because the way that it works is that you can coin a Parrot Sanctuary on turn 2, activate it, and then you can have double spawn pools, activate those, and then you can play Parrot Sanctuary into like a Glacial Shard, Parrot Sanctuary again, and that is 5 procs off of the South Sea Giant that is possible in order for you to play this card by turn 3. Now granted, you need a lot of cards to make this happen, because the other way that you can potentially make this happen is if you have double Parrot Sanctuary, you end up just activating it twice just for the sake of hitting it, then you get to play a Battle Cry, activate it twice again, and then you have your South Sea Giants ready to go. So this is just a really interesting deck that has a lot more depth than just going for infinite Fizzle every single game. This is a tempo deck that transitions into an infinite game plan if it needs to do such. And I think that this kind of concept is really interesting. And if I'm saying Hunter is interesting, you know it's a pretty cool deck. And the last archetype that I'm going to be talking about in the top 10 decks in the meta is going to be Deckless Location Warlock. This isn't the deckless version of the deck, but this is all in on trying to make locations really good, so that way, again, Seaside Giant is really, really good. You know, like, it's kind of crazy how this card was just a sleeper, and now that we have enough support with it, because Zerg's got given, you know, a couple locations, now it's like legitimately one of the best deck cards in this deck, because it gives you another 8/8 for you to play your Forge of Wills on. Now, this deck is kind of more all in on being like a hand Warlock with cards like Dark Alley Pact and Endgame, so you're just summoning endless streams of big minions, 8/8s, 15/15s with the Ceaseless, because you're still playing Lokins as well. This is just stat dump Warlock with some control tools, and you don't even need the wheel in this particular deck because you know you are going to end your opponent's life at some point with cards like Forge of Will, Ultra-less Cavern in order to summon a bunch of 8/8s. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, potentially 9, 10, 11 potential cards that are just 8/8s or more. That is a lot of stats, especially if you could just dump out a lot of stuff. Now, one thing that I kind of wish that this deck had the possibility of, which might be a bit of a copium, is what if I could play all of my 8/8s in one turn, play Bob, freeze my opponent's side of the field, and then just be like, what you gonna do? But that's the thing, you really don't need to do that, because if your opponent plays a bunch of 8/8s as early as like turn 4 or turn 5 or something like that, there's nothing that they're going to be able to do. So it's just a really interesting version of this deck. And actually one other card that I think is really interesting is Mass Production. Is it that good? I really don't know, but this deck is kind of struggling for 1-drops if you don't just play the spawning pool as early as turn 1. So I think this is probably one of the most interesting Warlock lists that we've seen in a while, but it also does kind of make me sad that the reason why this deck is good is because of Loken, because of Sarg, because of like Dark Alley Pact into like Forge of Wills. These cards are absolutely carrying Warlock right now, and after rotation, Warlock is looking like it's in a rough spot. But if you're somebody that really likes Wheel of Death and you absolutely need this in your deck, then go ahead and play this version of the deck. In fact, there is an argument to say that Wheel Warlock might be somewhat necessary right now, especially against these infinite decks. At the hands of these infinite decks, we need something that is going to be able to push them off the ladder, and Warlock might become that answer. Now, granted, it is kind of difficult in order to outvalue some of these infinite decks to where you might need to just like turbo jam Wheel by like turn 8 or something like that, but this is just kind of what's happening in the Hearthstone top legend right now. It's a lot of people feeling like they're not necessarily playing good decks, they are just playing okay decks that have oppressive win rates against what they are experimenting against. So like with Weapon Rogue, for example, you absolutely need a deck that hates on that in order to have a consistent win rate against that, or against like a Dumbgar Druid, you need like something with consistent aggression in order to make their scam not that consistent. So this is pretty much what's going on with Wheel Warlock, because if the infinite decks are taking over, this might be one of the only real ways of trying to counteract it. And now we're going to start getting into the fun decks that I believe are really good. And I actually have a bold claim to make. I would actually put Hero Power Druid as a top 5 deck in the meta right now, but there is just way too much data that hasn't been collected because I literally just started playing this deck yesterday, but I almost went from 2,000 to top 1,000 with a 60% win rate. I had a 70% win rate with this deck at one point, but it's not this version of the deck that I was playing. This is the Patient Zero, where I saw this deck and I'm like, wait a minute. There is something going on here. What exactly is happening here? And this is the truth, by the way. If you go into HSGuru and you see the person that was playing this deck originally, I think they only went like 3-0 or 3-2 or something like that in the bronze ranks. But what happened is this deck popped up on HSGuru, everyone saw it, went, Hero Power Druid, let's give it a try, and now everybody has been trying this deck in the past 24 hours to where this is actually a deck that has a 55% win rate, not only on HSGuru, but also on HSReplay. And here's the thing. You know this deck is bad because it's only running 1 copy of Frost Lotus Seedling. You definitely need 2 copies of this card. I really don't agree with the MC tech, for example. Like, I feel like this is just the only card that needs to be cut, and the rest of this deck is really, really good. Maybe Innervated is a little bit of a stretch too, but I have a deck that I want to show you that I was playing a lot yesterday. So another streamer that I know by the name of Onkrad was playing a very similar list to where I was playing this list primarily, and I think I started legitimately like 10-3 or like I forget exactly what it was, but I had an insane start where I think I was 9-1 at some point with this deck, and then I just kept playing it because I'm like, this deck's actually not only really good, but it is an insane amount of fun. But while I was playing the deck, I found out these notes. You definitely want the only Protoss cards in the deck to be Construct Pylons, Chrono Boost, and Artanis for the following reason. You want to just mulligan for Chrono Boost as quickly as you can, so that way you can play it, hopefully get Construct Pylon into Artanis, so that way you can play Artanis consistently by turn 5. And that is one of the real big powers of this deck, is that when you play Groovy Cat, it actually doesn't need to be played after you play Artanis. Groovy Cat gives your hero power essentially an aura of always having +1 more attack if your hero power gives you attack. So when you switch from Artanis, when you switch from Malfurion to Artanis, the Groovy Cat's abilities will already be on the hero power of the Artanis. Currently, when the game launched, Groovy Cat didn't work this way, but after 2 days, they had a bug patch in order to fix some interactions, and this was one of the interactions that was fixed, because Artanis's hero power does say give a friendly minion and your hero +1 attack this turn. So you're effectively giving a minion and your hero +2 attack, +3 attack, +4 attack, or if you play both Groovy Cats and have them die, +5 attack. So for 2 mana, you are effectively giving yourself 10 charge damage. So what happens when you play a sing-along buddy or a popular pixie in order to give yourself ridiculous levels of OTKs? And the reason why this deck is consistent is because you also have Chrono Boost that can give you a charge minion. So even if you don't stick a minion, and all you need to do is just stick a 1/1, by the way. If you don't stick a minion, you can play the second Construct Pylons into the second Chrono Boost in order to get that charge minion, play your sing-along buddy, hero power, and that is already 23 damage. That is a lot of damage. And one other card to talk about is actually Astral Phaser. This card is absolutely insane in this deck because of this ability right here. Choose an enemy minion, it goes dormant for 2 turns. Goodbye taunts that gain armor. Goodbye threats that might kill me and I need to stall for an extra turn. It's absolutely insane how good making an enemy minion dormant is and how perfectly it fits with this deck right here. But what have I told you? I still don't believe this is the perfect 30. Because I gotta be honest, I played this deck about 15 games. Ceaseless Expanse and Mista Vista I did not play one time. I did not play them once. I think I had one game where Ceaseless maybe could have been playable, but it didn't win me the game because I was going up against another deck that just played Ceaseless immediately back. So what do we do if we don't like these cards? All I did was take out the Mista Vista and the Ceaseless Expanse, and I decided to put in Grifta and Leroy Jenkins, so that way we have more possibilities of having charge damage. The Leroy is obvious. You just play it with the hero power, and that is a lot of tempo that is coming out of nowhere. But there is another card that I feel like absolutely deserves a spot in this deck because Mista Vista obviously can give you the amulet that takes control of an enemy minion. So for 1 mana, you can give yourself not only an opponent minion that might get in the way, but it is a 1 mana charge minion, so you can immediately go for the sing-along buddy into potential popular Pipsy high rolls. Oh my lord, does that sound busted? Now, I do agree that cards like Innervate maybe should be in this deck, but the issue that I kind of have with this card is that you really don't care about it in a lot of instances unless you are like coining out turn 3 Chrono Boost and you already have Construct Pylons to do that. And it's just like, I really don't want to cut any cards in this deck. Like, you have the Arcanite Revelation for card draw. Cactus Construct might be the cut, but it does give you a possibility of literally going for extra copies of 2-drops you definitely want. Sing-along buddy, popular pixie, groovy cat. I mean, if we just look at the 2-mana cards in general, you still have some pretty good cards like Loot Hoarder, Blood Mage Thalnos, some cards that can give you minions. There's actually the Dragon card, if I can find it, that gives you extra copies of minions, so that way you always just have something that you're throwing onto the field. Like, there's actually a lot of really good 2-drops to get from this card. And if I can find the card that I'm thinking about, because I know it's not a priest card, it's a neutral card. Here we go, the Whelp Wrangler. So it's like you have lots of possibilities of making this deck actually legitimate, and I went from about 2k legend to almost top 1000 with about a 60% win rate. In fact, let me just show you my win rate. And here was my win rate with the archetype in general. I went 19 and 11, had a 63% win rate, but I'm honestly kind of disappointed because we would have had a 70% win rate if our last 5 games weren't the unluckiest thing in the world. Unfortunately, this is where we started to hit a wall. I was getting a little bit tired, probably wasn't playing that optimally, but we just had a beautiful, look at this beautiful start with this deck. So much green. So believe me when I tell you, I really do believe that Hero Power Druid might be one of the best decks in the game, but because it emerged onto the meta yesterday, we're gonna need some more data to figure out just how good this archetype really is. And next up, we just have the Zerg DK decks. I really don't want to spend too much time talking about them because I've already made a video going into great detail about these decks. But what I will do is just talk about why each and every single one of these 3 specific Zerg decks is running the blood runes or the specific runes that they are. Because the only reason why you even care about running double blood rune is so that way you can play a card like Orbital Moon. Orbital Moon gives a minion taunt and lifesteal, so that way if you have like really big minions like a 10-10 Zergling, for example, then you can give that 10-10 Zergling not only rush because you have the location, for example, but you can also give it lifesteal and taunt, so that way it heals you and presents a really big threat. It also has freaking Reborn, so it comes back as a like, this is just a really good synergy depending on what cards you put it on. But I would argue some of the best cards you can put it on are going to be cards like your Baneling, for example, because giving this thing not only Reborn but lifesteal and taunt, you just put up a wall that heals you for a massive amount, and this is really the only comeback mechanic that is really available in this sort of deck. You do have like Airlock Breach as another reason to run the Blood Rune, and it does kind of make sense because this gives you a lot of stats all in one turn. But more times than not, if you're playing Airlock Breach, you're not focusing on the main win condition of this deck. Maybe you cut one Airlock Breach for like a second Viper or something like that, but I really don't know. This just seems to be the best version of this deck if you want to play Orbital Moon. Then we have the Double Frost Unholy version of this deck, literally so we could play the cards Harbinger of Winter, Horn of Winter, as well as Rezka the Pit Boss. So it really makes sense why we want Rezka in the deck, because we have lots of Death Rattle synergy. But the tempo that's generated from always having like an extra little bit of pocket mana makes a lot of sense. And one thing that I kind of wish that we could do is that we could fit in a Yodeler in this deck. But every single list that I've seen that plays Double Frost Unholy, that plays Yelling Yodeler, it seems to just like kind of just nerf the win rate a little bit, because you really need to focus on tempo as well as actually getting that Infestor value as quickly as possible. You're not really able to be greedy with this kind of card, because if you think about it, Death Growl kind of does Yelling Yodeler's ability automatically on the field depending on what your circumstance is. So it's like you're pretty much doubling the Death Rattle immediately with this kind of 1-mana card. So it does kind of outclass Yelling Yodeler in that aspect. But regardless, it's the exact same deck. You try to play Infestor, you try to give her a Reborn so that way you make the biggest board possible, and then you go Ungy Bungy to the face. And lastly, we have Rainbow Zerg for the only reason of playing Rainbow for Rainbow Seamstress, as well as playing Rezka and Airlock Breach. I just really think it's very interesting how Death Knight decks can take this much of a dramatic turn to where you have some people that are like, nope, I don't want Rezka at all, and there's other people that are like, we absolutely need a Rezka in this deck, because it just makes sense. Why wouldn't you run Rezka into Yodeler in order to deny things like Dumbgar Druid, for example? I really feel like this is the best version of the deck, if you want my honest opinion, but I'm not going to spend all day playing Zerg DK, because as the meta develops, a lot more archetypes are becoming more volatile against this deck, to where it really does feel like a glorified scam deck, to where if you just don't hit this card, you just don't have a win condition. I have to say that. I don't like it when my deck needs to draw the only good card in order for it to be good. So it's just like, this archetype is decent, it does have some other powerful synergies, but it really does not work unless you have your Infestor synergies rolling. So if you want to play what I think is the best version of Zerg DK, I think Rainbow is just the way to go, because you have some lifesteal, you have mind control mechanics, and you also have Yelling Yodeler, just maximizing your potential of Death Rattles. And now I'm going to start talking about the decks that I feel like are super close to being there, but some of these decks just feel like they don't have enough support or enough gas or enough sustain in order to keep themselves alive, do their combo fast enough, or just compete with the meta. And one archetype that I really enjoy, but sadly just can't figure out how exactly to make this work, is Protoss Rogue. This is a deck that I get a lot of requests to like try and build a deck for, because some people are like, Clark, I got killed by like turn 7 against this deck. It seems like it's the nuts. How do I beat it? People are asking me how to beat Protoss Rogue. You beat it by just hitting them in the face, man. That's all you need to do. Like, the only way that this deck can really work is by doing the following. You are essentially trying to play double Templar. It doesn't matter which one. There's Dark Templar as well as High Templar. It doesn't matter which Templar fuses with what, but if you play a second one when you have one on the field, they merge into Archon, which at the end of the turn deals 8 damage to the enemy hero and 2 damage to their minions. So depending if you play like High Templar or not, then your Archon can effectively deal 10 damage to the face. So the way that you can make this combo really sing is by discounting the High Templars and then playing them for 1 mana with Sonya, or discounting them so frequently to where you just play as many of them as possible, play Cover Artist, so then that way you can hopefully get your 3rd Archon to deal enough damage to kill the opponent. But here's the issue with this deck. It is all in on the combo to where you really don't have a lot of ways of fighting for the board. And this is a version of the deck made by JAlex that actually has a kind of ingenious way of dealing with this problem. Greedy Partner. Greedy Partner actually the MVP of this list right here. I only managed to go like 7 and 6 with it, but it's like, this is the only version of Protoss Rogue that I've been able to maintain above a 60% win rate with. So it's like, the fact that I even went 7-6, I think that that's an accomplishment. And the reason why we did that is because we primarily played Greedy Partner on 2 with a lot of these cards in hand. You know, we got Quick Pick, Photon Cannon, Eviscerate, and Blink. consistency for that greedy partner is definitely there. So that way we could coin into Chrono Boost in order to draw the cards from the deck, or particularly my favorite move, we can coin Sandbox Scoundrel on 4, and then we can play Void Ray for 0 mana, so that way we can actually fight back on the board as well as getting that 1 mana Scoundrel, because this is a deck that is very dependent on getting the 1 mana Scoundrel. And that's kind of the problem with it. It is a play Scoundrel or die type deck to where you have to run other cards in the list that can maybe prevent you from dying if you don't have these synergies. So it's like, that's the reason why we're playing 1 Warp Gate. That's the reason why we're playing Photon Cannon, because I can already hear a lot of people typing in the comments, but Clark HELLSCREAM, if you play Photon Cannon, then you're not able to get your Sonya synergy. Yeah, that's kind of the point with this deck. There's a lot of dyssynergies and a lot of specific plays that you kind of have to make because you're not always going to go for Sonya. In fact, one way that you usually play this deck is by tempoing the Dark Templar, so that way it's a stealth minion, it sticks on the field, and then the next turn, you can maybe play your High Templar, go for tempo, you have your Archon that sticks for a turn by some miracle of God, so that way you can go face with it and then play Cover Artist. There are some times where you can kind of tempo out the combo and be a little bit more loose with it, but more times than not, you're just trying to play your Photon Cannons, you're just trying to get Artanis onto the field as quickly as possible, and then you try to play your Warp Gates, so that way your Templars are usually going to be 0 mana, you can maybe play all 4 of them, then play Cover Artist for like this ultimate combo if you don't have Sonya synergies, because obviously you could do like Sonya stuff with 1 mana Scoundrel. If you play Artanis, then it discounts the Templars to 4 mana, so that way when you play the 1 mana Scoundrel, the Templars cost 1 and it works with Sonya. But that is a Christmas land situation that really doesn't happen that frequently, and this is the type of combo deck that really forces you to think about how can I win as quickly as possible instead of how can I combo as quickly as possible. So if you want to play this version of the deck, I think it's the best version, but there is one other list that does have my attention. Now, I don't believe that this is that good of a deck in all honesty, but when I was looking around on HSReplay and HSGuru for like a bunch of different archetypes and, you know, deck lists that were seeing success, this was pretty much it, and I find it kind of interesting how like there is somewhat of a high roll with like Breakdance, for example, because if you have like a 0 mana Void Ray, for example, and then you just play Void Ray into Breakdance, play Void Ray again, that is 3 5-attack minions that can trade into the board, so that's actually kind of decent. But the issue with the card like Breakdance is that I don't know what else you would play it with. What, are you going to play it with Dark Templar? Are you going to play it with High Templar? You really don't want to play Breakdance on those kind of cards because you really need the discounts to stack. And if you're just going to play Warp Gate into High Templar and then bring it back, you're going to have to tap the Warp Gate again. So I really don't know how good this version of the deck is, but there's also this potential of quick pick into Sword Shiner on turn 3, and it's just, okay, we have a 3/3 weapon now that can potentially trade into some minions as well as drawing cards. That really doesn't sound like that bad of a circumstance, but this is how bad of a circumstance this deck is in right now, to where you have to think about, yeah, it's not that bad. It's pretty good, but if it's not that bad, then it's not that good. And you have like Fan of Knives in order to like counteract like 1/1s and stuff like that. But we're really scraping the bottom of the barrel in terms of rogue consistency, to where I would not be surprised to see rogue players going back to Psycho Rogue here pretty soon, because this archetype is a lot of fun. But what keeps it, what prevents people from having more fun with it is how weak the deck is in general. So is Protoss Rogue that good? I think it's one of the worst Protoss decks available right now. And to keep the Protoss train going, we're going to talk about the deck that Theo played at the Hearthstone event that I actually think might be one of the best ways of being able to play the Protoss Mage archetype. It's essentially a freeze control stall mage that is waiting in order to pop off its combo so it can finally win, but against some of the armor decks, you kind of need cards like Fizzle in order to break through all of the armor. So you have Fizzle in order to work with Colossus to just give you a bunch of value out of nowhere, or you could potentially use Fizzle on like cards like Resonance Oil. I keep saying Reconnaissance on accident, but you could use the Fizzle on like the Coil, the Shield Battery, some of these other Discover cards, so that way you can keep gassing your Colossus minion. Now, I think I made one change to the Theo deck, and I can't remember what card I took out, but I do remember that I specifically put in Bob the Bartender. I'm pretty sure that I made this change, because it's just another way of being able to freeze the board and stall out, or maybe, just maybe, you can play Find a Triple, hit a Fizzle, and then you have a bunch of Colossus minions that are there. So it's like, it's not exactly the greatest tool if you're going to be drawing a minion with it, but it does have its moments, especially at being able to freeze the board and keeping you alive, because you just need to keep yourself alive until you play a Colossus that will definitely wipe the board. Will just smoke the board, and then you can play your second one to hopefully kill your opponent. How often are you going to be able to get this card up to 15 damage? Not that frequently, so you're probably gonna have to play both of your copies of Colossus, and that is why you need 2 copies of Warp Gate in order to make this actually playable, because this card being 12 mana with only Photon Cannons, it's gonna be 10 mana, so you have to run some other form of discount in order to make this card playable. So that's just kind of how this cookie crumbles. This is just the version of the deck that I think I enjoy the most for the following 2 synergies. You have Hollow Technician actually seeing play as a removal card, and then you have Seabreeze Chalice, which is really taking advantage of the nerf to it by only hitting minions. So now you can use your Hollow Technician in a very effective way to guarantee kill up to 6 minions for 6 mana if you decide to play all of the chalices with your Hollow Technician. And I think that synergy is absolutely insane because it gives you ways of being able to stall. And then you have Mezzadune, which kind of makes sense in this deck, because Mezzadune can draw Sleet Skaters, so that way you're just constantly freezing and gaining armor. Exactly what this deck wants to do. Stalling, and stalling even harder. So I don't know. I think this might be the best version of the deck, but Protoss Mage is in a similar spot as Rogue, to where this deck just kind of can't get there at times because its weakness is not keeping itself alive. It's not killing you. It's not killing your opponent fast enough because. Oh, well, it's a helicopter that just flew by. Sorry if you guys heard that. But yeah, the whole point of this deck is to stall into your Colossus, and sometimes you're just not able to end the game because you don't have your Colossus come down before you get overwhelmed by the meta right now. Like, gaining armor can be effective, but if you're not actively removing the board, you're just kind of a target for your opponent just to keep swinging minions at. So this deck is fun. It's definitely one of my more favorite archetypes that's come out from this expansion, but unfortunately, the win rate for this deck is just kind of not there. But if you want to go in a little bit of a different direction where you're playing for tempo instead of playing for stalling, then this is one way of being able to play the deck. Now, I really don't believe in this version of the deck, but I wanted to give you guys, some different ways of being able to play these archetypes, because when I was looking up on the data, this actually had the highest win rate at the highest MMR for Protoss Mage. And I just think that that's weird. I feel like the only way this deck has a consistent win rate is because a Mantle Shaper may be getting some kind of, cheese scam game because you just played 10-10 in stats and your opponent couldn't deal with it. So the possibility is there for this archetype to maybe be good later on, but in this particular meta with like Weapon Rogue, with Dumbgar Druid, and with infinite armor decks running amok right now, it is really hard for a tempo deck, let alone a tempo deck with a combo, to be really good right now. Next up, we're going to have what I believe is the second best Protoss deck if HP Druid, or if Hero Power Druid literally didn't come out yesterday. So Protoss Mage actually feels like it's super close to being a real deck. And by the way, if I didn't mention this, almost all of these decks that we're going over, I am planning on making videos on. I've already gotten a lot of clips with the Protoss classes. I've got some Infinite Shaman gameplay I'm going to be showing you. And my next deck on my list right now is playing Zerg Location Hunter and getting some Zerg decks in the mix, because I really haven't played the Warlock or the Hunter that much. But I definitely have been experimenting with every single Protoss deck, and let me tell you, I really do believe that my deck is the best version of this list, because every single list doesn't feel like it's teching itself for the meta. And one card that I feel like absolutely needs to be in this deck, especially if you're playing a Love Everlasting, is Repackage. Repackage is like one of the only reasons why this deck can meaningfully fight up against like a Zerg DK, or like a Hunter that's gonna, or like a Warlock that plays a bunch of 8/8s, for example. Like, yeah, you could play Shatterword Ruin in order to deal with those 8/8s, But you're not always going up against 8/8 decks at different kinds of MMR. Sometimes you just need a very clean board wipe in order to give yourself one more turn to make it to that mothership combo. And the way this deck in particular works is that you want to play Sentry as many copies as you can, and I really do mean as many copies as you can. You want to get copies from Creation Protocol, from Power Chord Synchronize. You can use one hallucination on the Sentry, but depending on the circumstance, maybe you do play both hallucinations on the Sentry if you have nothing else in the early game, and you can always use like a power chord on a mothership later on. But the general idea is that you want to try and kill off like 5, 6 of these little guys, so that way the mothership can cost about, you know, like 7, 6 mana. But the more important thing is that the Protoss minions that you get out of this card are actually generally pretty cheap. So if we just take a look at the Protoss minions that are available, you have obviously Sentry, you have Void Ray, which is kind of a low roll, but you do have other cards like Immortal, like Carrier, which is really good. You have Colossus, which is obviously very good, and then you have the Archon minions that are extremely good. So if you discount these cards by 6 mana, then you can literally play these cards for free. You can play the Colossus for like 5 mana or something like that, or 6 mana. It's just, you really need to get these discounts not just for the mothership itself, but primarily because the win conditions that are made from the mothership are going to be so cheap that you can just play a bunch of them and automatically win the game. I'll tell you right now, dude, I had a game where I think I played like so many Sentries that they were discounting for like 7 or 8 mana, and that just carries. It really just does. So in order to get to that game plan, you need other cards that help you survive. You gotta run a Photon Cannon in order to get those discounts, as well as having some removal. You need Thrive in order to find the right spells, Holy Nova for some removal in the early game, Chrono Boost in order to have some, you know, like actual consistency to drawing your cards, as well as having a 3/4 trade into the board. It may be a charge minion, but it's trading into the board most of the time. And then you have Warp Gate in a situation to where you couldn't really copy your Sentries. I absolutely love this deck, if you guys couldn't tell. There's just so many ways of generating a bunch of motherships to where it really does feel like you're just rolling the dice on finding some good win conditions, but you really aren't rolling the dice that consistently because you have like half of the cards being good to randomly generate. This deck feels super close to being a real deck, and I really do believe that this version of the deck, my version, is probably the best one that you could be playing right now. But one other synergy that I feel like needs to be talked about this archetype was actually discovered by Dane Hearth. This is his version of the deck. Now I'm gonna go ahead and tell you, I think Raw Den is bait. I would not run this particular card, but the reason why we're talking about this deck is because of Pip the Potent. One thing to keep in mind, if your Sentry is 1 mana, it works with Pip. So all you have to do is play a Photon Cannon, have your Sentries in hand, play Pip, and then you can make extra copies of not only the Sentry, but the hallucination as well. Absolutely massive, dude. This synergy is ridiculously good for the following reason. If you make a bunch of 1 mana copies of Sentry, and then you kill off a Sentry, then the rest of your Sentries are going to be 0, so you can just jam them onto the board immediately. Like, this is absolutely gigabrain, but the one thing that can kind of draw people away from this idea is the fact of adding extra minions into the deck, so that way cards like Pendant of Earth or Creation Protocol are not as likely to find the minion that you want. And this also needs to be said, Aman'Thul 100% needs to be in this deck. So if you want my advice, I would say take out the Raw Den, put in the Aman'Thul, and you are absolutely cooking most of your opponents that are on the ladder right now with this deck. Because sometimes you gotta pull a Zeddy and you just gotta play as many Aman'Thuls as possible. If you get that reference, you get the reference. But yeah. Protoss Priest feels super close to being a real deck, and if it had just like one more AoE tool, I think it could actually be like a top contender in this meta right now. But now that we've talked a lot about Protoss, let's move on to the other factions. Let's talk about Zerg decks. Yeah, Zerg Hunter. I told you guys earlier that I'm really interested in this archetype, but I decided to also show this list to you guys because there are some people that just don't want to play Infinite Fizzle. There are some people that just want to play Tempo. They just want to go face, and all they want to do is disrupt, disrupt, disrupt. So I think that a lot of the other cards that were like the Infinite cards were taken out for cards like Titan Forge Traps. You have Ceaseless Faceless Expanse that finds its way into this deck because it's just decent at removing the board. I really can't find all the cards that are completely different from the Infinite Fizzle list, but hey, if you want to try and actually play for tempo and meaningfully win the game by rushing down your opponent with damage every single turn, this might be one way to do it. But another thing that I really like about this deck is that it is just a value deck with Ranjari Scout and the possibility of getting the XR Natalie combo. So it's just like, there's some Discover synergies to this as well. I really like Discover Hunter theoretically and conceptually, but then when I start playing the deck, I almost never know what to do because there's so many options. But if you're somebody that really likes to play like a different version of Hunter that doesn't run Infinite Fizzle shenanigans, this is probably just the way of going about it. But if you're somebody that wants to play more so for tokens and for smaller minions and making cards like Saddle Up feel like they should have unnerfed this card, then maybe you can play this deck that focuses more on being aggressive than ever playing for value. And this is a deck that I can't remember, or we never saw the deck for Donkey on the event where he was playing like a Zerg Hunter that was all in on face damage. I think this might be a recreation of that deck. But the whole point of this deck is just to kill command and just to go face and to play Hydralisk for a ton of damage, because if you stick a bunch of Zerglings onto the field, then this card can just deal unholy amounts of damage. But you want to win the game with cards like Hydralisk because you're just going to have a ton of value that can come out from the Zerglings always being on the field. You have other synergies that are possible with like Parrot Sanctuary, you have Roach, you have a lot of battle cries in this deck, to where I really find it shocking that we don't find a way to fit in the Giants. But I feel like we're just trying to have more consistent ways of just pushing onto the field with cards like Patchwork Pals in order to give us Huffer and Leok and all that nonsense. We have Camouflage Mount, which might be one of the best aggro tools for Hunter right now. The possibility of rolling Wind Fury is nothing you should ever sleep on, especially if you have a lot of stats onto the field. So this just feels like a good old fashioned face Hunter. But it does have some high roll potential with like Brood Queen, with Kerrigan, and you have like some kind of late game strategies because the hero power exists for Kerrigan. But more times than not, you're just gonna run your opponent to the ground by turn 6, turn 7, and then kill him off with a kill command just like the old days. What do I say about this deck, guys? What do I say about Zerg Demon Hunter? Demon Hunter is the worst class according to the data right now, and Zerg Demon Hunter might be one of the worst decks to be playing right now for the sole purpose of it only goes face, does nothing else, and it still can't win games right now. I feel like if we didn't have like Arcanite Defense Crystal in the meta right now, Demon Hunter would absolutely be slapping cheeks and literally just farming everything in the meta right now. But there's so much lifesteal, there's a decent amount of taunts that you can bypass, but it's just like the lifesteal and the armor that is possible in this meta makes it to where I think Demon Hunter is just completely unplayable right now. I had to do some digging to find this deck, and I still don't even think it's that good, but this just seems to be the best way of playing the deck, to where you're playing Zerg minions as well as like the attack synergies. And there might even be an argument just to cut the Zerg cards and just go all in on just running cards like Acupuncture, for example. So it's just like, it really sucks that Demon Hunter doesn't really have like, it doesn't have a direction at the moment. It's just go face. That's it. That's all the tools they seem to ever give Demon Hunter, to where Controlled Demon Hunter is laughable. Highlander Demon Hunter has never been a thing. Big Demon Hunter was kind of a thing, but then they nerfed the Naga that was responsible for it. Naga Demon Hunter was kind of a thing, but then they ended up nerfing it because Demon Hunter decks are either really good or really bad. I really can't think of a time where there was like a balanced Demon Hunter deck that felt like it had an even win rate. There was Relic Demon Hunter that scammed you. There was Il'gynoth OTK that scammed you. I'm running out of examples, man. There's just not that many Demon Hunter decks that really seem to fit the bill on either being really good or there's just no good Demon Hunter decks. I'm sorry, I don't know what else to say. There's nothing good for this class. If you want to play Demon Hunter, this is pretty much it. And the last two decks that we're going to be going over are going to be Terran Starship decks, one for Paladin and one for Warrior. I have good news about Paladin, and I have some kind of bad news about Paladin as well. The good news is the Starship cards are somewhat playable. The bad news is you're just playing aggro Paladin. Like, you're just playing minions for the sake of having minions onto the field, so that way you can play Crusaders or Flash Sale. This deck is essentially just aggro Paladin, but with Starship pieces. Now, is that exactly a bad thing? Not particularly, but I really despise seeing, oh, we have a good Paladin deck? What is it? Oh, it's hand buff Paladin? oh, it's just Crusader or a Paladin? Like, this just seems to be the only version of Paladin that really isn't even doing remotely well right now. And at top legend, Paladin completely falls off at top legend. It's like, it was really difficult for me to find this list, but Glory, the world champion Glory, is still playing this deck on the Asia server, I believe, at around top 100 legend. There's one other streamer that I know named Otsu that has also been playing this version of the deck, but he has not made his deck list public. So I really just don't know how else to play this archetype other than stick a minion, play Crusader's Aura, play Flash Sale. Every now and again, you might be able to launch a Starship, have some value, and then bring it back with Jim Raynor. And like, one other card that I feel like maybe we should talk about is the Hellion, because when you launch a Starship, it becomes a +2 attack and give your minion rush card. But this card really just doesn't matter in a lot of circumstances, because then you have to launch the ship. Like, you have to have the SCV. And the thing that I think is really weird about Paladin in particular is that it does have a way of discounting the Starships, but it's a 3-mana card. Shaman has 2 1-mana cards that reduce the cost by 2. So it's like, this card just feels extremely awkward. And also because the 2/2 Marines with Taunt really aren't that impactful. So it's like, you saw me like gassing up Liftoff, for example, but Salvage the Bunker is just like, this is just a really bad card in my opinion. It's way too expensive. I don't know how else to put it. It's way too expensive. So it's like, this deck has some gas going for it, but it's effectively just an aggro Paladin that just does the exact same thing that we would expect. And last and almost actually least, if Demon Hunter was the last deck I would have talked about, this is probably the second worst archetype in the game. I'm sorry to end it on a stinker right now, but I wanted to try to find a deck that could maybe utilize Thor, but this is pretty much it. Sadly, this type of warrior just gets completely outclassed by the hydration infinite shenanigans that are possible, because this isn't even like a tempo deck. It's like a weird mid-range control deck that's just trying to be like, hey guys, I want to play Thor and see how it works. And unfortunately, this is just not a good deck. I really don't even know what else to talk about, because it's like, why would you play this when the other hydration warrior exists? So it's like, I wanted to try and find like a deck of every single like playable faction. So like a Terran warrior, Terran paladin, Terran everything, like Protoss everything, Zerg everything. I think I did a good job, but with this warrior deck, dude, there's just not a lot going for it. I wouldn't even recommend playing this deck. I just have this deck in the video in order to tell you guys to avoid this deck like the plague. Unfortunately, unless somebody can cook something up with this terrible amount of ingredients, that just, even Gordon Ramsay is going to be like, this is raw! This is a raw Hearthstone deck! How dare you launch this without preparing it adequately? And just, that was the worst Gordon Ramsay impression you've ever heard. But yeah, this warrior deck, don't play it. Just don't play it. But there you guys have it. Those are the best decks in the game, and I really do believe that I tried everything I could to give you guys as many decks that have the new cards as possible. So if you enjoy this kind of content, like this video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you want to support the content directly, go to the Patreon. I'm losing my voice, so I need to leave before I choke out in space. So thank you guys so much for making it to the end of this deck intro, this deck video, whatever you want to call it, and we'll see you for the next video.